All right, let's get going. Welcome, everyone. So while attendees are coming in, we'll do the greetings. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And we have some registrations from Europe as well. Thanks, everyone, for joining the webinar. We really appreciate your time. We will be talking today about the recent FERC approval of NERC CIP-003 version 9, CIP-003-9. They call it supply chain. All the participants are muted, so we won't be able to hear you, but we do wish that you put questions into the chat or the Q&A. We'll catch it either way, whatever you're comfortable with, but by all means, this webinar is for you, so be sure to ask questions. Everyone probably has something burning. There are no stupid questions. There are a lot of new people to compliance, so someone else is probably thinking the same thing you are. So by all means, please feel free to ask questions. We are recording, and it will be posted later today, I believe. We should probably get it out today. On the Ampere AmpereSec, AMPERESEC.com. We have an activity page that shows all of the things that we do, and on there you'll see this recording for the future if you want to share it. Check our socials as well. We'll probably post it there. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and kick off some introductions. I am Patrick Miller, and I'm apparently not driving well. I'm Patrick Miller. I am CEO of Ampere. A former recovering regulator, as I like to say, one of the original architects of the NERC CIP standards, started around 20 years ago. Also ex-utility guy, former principal investigator for a DOE project, various things, and now just consulting firm. And Ron, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, I'm Ron Fabella. I'm with Patrick. Yeah, a long time in the field. Started out NERC CIP, probably not as way back as you go, Patrick, but during the 3 to 5 transition, and worked at some asset owners and some pre-audit, and had to explain what IP routable was to way too many people. But yeah, happy to be here.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jason Smith. Thanks for joining us today. I've been in the industry since 2004, originally as a systems and network administrator, eventually transitioning to risk management. Moved over to regulatory compliance back in 2012. So I oversaw the version 3 program. My previous company oversaw the transition from version 5 to version 6. And then did that until 2018. And since then, I've been consulting and helping people out, run their programs or providing oversight for the programs and helping out with large scale projects.
And I guess I'm rounding out Carter Manucci with NRECA. It's been a while around NERC CIP. Previous to NRECA, I spent 27 years with a municipal out of Orlando, but we had a lot of assets. Implementation of the program was part of NERC CIP back in the day when that thing was still a thing. Written a few of the items that are actually we'll be talking about today. So I'll punt on most of my history because it doesn't really matter. What matters is what you guys get out of this webinar.
All right. Okay, so what happened, right? First things first, FERC approved this order. It was back in March. You can see the little snapshot at the top there, but really what it comes down to, they were adding new requirements focused on supply chain risk management for low impact BES Cyber Systems. Those of you that have been around NERC CIP know what that means. That's basically the critical stuff inside your facility. Low impact is kind of the lowest threshold. And everyone has these expectations, and they're valid because this is exactly what's happened, is that the low impact stuff is always going to continue to ratchet up. We're going to be continually adding things to low. In some cases, what was medium will just get pushed into low. And in this case, that's pretty much what happened. And we'll talk about kind of the details about what this, it really looks a lot like one of the medium requirements as well. So an overview of the changes, if you take a look at the red line to the last standard, this is pretty much it. This is like all that really changed. In terms of additions. So it's just the section 6, and it's really about vendor electronic remote access security controls for assets containing low impact BES cyber systems. Of course, there's always the language. It's not a low impact cyber asset. It's the asset containing, and then there's cyber assets inside that support. But your requirements, as you can see, are one or more methods for determining vendor electronic remote access. Notice that these are lowercase terms, and we'll talk about that. So this is not defined in the glossary of terms. One or more methods for disabling the vendor electronic remote access. So you have to determine it, disable it, and then methods for detecting known or suspected inbound and outbound malicious communications. So looking for things that are obviously, malware or other things in the communication stream. What is removed is all the GTBs and all of the reference architectures, and we'll talk about some of that coming up. All right, Carter, I'm going to lean on you a little bit for this slide. We know this was the progression, but tell us more about what this stack means.
So I was, I guess you could blame me for a lot of the Section 1600 data requests as it stays, as it came out. Back in 2018, I believe, I was at a CIPC meeting and some straw man polls came out about the Section 1600 data requests that they wanted to do to try to determine the risk to low impact, supply chain risk to low impact. And when that draft came out, I looked at it and they wanted to have everybody inventory every single low impact thing in their environment.
Yes.
Which those of you that have been around for a little while know that is not only something we don't have to do for CIP-2, but is almost an impossible task for a lot of different asset owners out there. If you have a huge inventory or even, even a generation facility, I mean, it's just a huge task to undertake to do that. So I looked at it and I'm like, there's got to be a better way, guys. We've got to focus on the risk. We've got to figure out a way that we can categorize things in big enough buckets so that we can just, drive at what is actually the risk to the BES. So that's kind of what happened with that 1600 data request, and they came out with different types of areas for you to report on, generation of certain sizes, and much like the NERC or the CIP-2 bright line criteria, some of that stuff was just, let's see how the weather is, and there's no rhyme or reason behind some of the numbers. And I had thrown that out as just some guidelines thinking, okay, well, maybe these are good buckets to put things in. And it kind of stuck and went forward. And we never really had a great discussion around if those numbers are right or not. So that's what you see in the report. But that generated a risk assessment report from NERC staff. We'll talk about some specifics into that, which then fed into SAR through the Board of Trustees that was voted on, and that created the drafting team, which then fought over what the words meant to put down on paper to create a standard of CIP-003-9.
Yes, and you can say blame you, but we actually should be thanking you for making some sense here, because they were going to move forward with something that was just a really bad idea. So it took you and a handful of others to kind of, I'm sorry, but grab them by the lapels and say, don't do this. There's a better way. Right. So, and let's see. Ron, I'm going to lean on you for this one. So tell me more about what these graphs, why is this important?
So I was going back and we have not Carter to blame for this side, but maybe the numbers that came out of the rescoping of the idea of this assessment report was fascinating. So this came out in 2020, the actual outcome of the data request.
Right.
And what I found was fascinating was some of the wordsmithing around what's external connectivity, what's external remote connectivity, and then what's vendor external remote connectivity, and then how they sliced and diced around assets. And so I pulled these two out. The link to the report's there. It's a fairly standard NERC report, right? There's a lot of here's why we did these things, and there's a little bit of here's the outcomes. And then what I found fascinating was they were very careful not to really do any analysis on the data, just kind of say, here's the data. But what they did say was that, and it was almost in a surprised tone, was, oh, there's a significant percentage of these low impact sites that do have third party access. And I think they called that out 2 or 3 times. And the third party is critical because kind of the nerds in the group, we can all argue about what's external connection, right? Or connectivity. Is that enterprise to the low impact site? Is that through the jump host? But they were very specific to say third party access, which means non-asset owner access. And I think it was further down the report where they were almost surprised by the number. And here's a few charts. Obviously a lot of the resources for low impact were in the sub 500 megawatt generation assets. So there may be some reading of the tea leaves there as to what type of third parties would want to have access there. But just generally, they said out of the 1,000+ entities that this data call went out to, 87% responded first. You have to like filter down that they had low impact assets, and but then out of that 87%, they said that over half had this external connectivity. It was just like wow. So you can kind of see, just even though this was 3 years ago, I think really, and Carter, you'll have to correct me, the results of this data call was probably the catalyst to really drive, hey, we need to do an update to 003. And I think before that, the last major update to 03 was what, in 2014. So this seemed to be a shock, and it gave them the ammunition, it seems, to add these new requirements.
Well, this was really the goal. When NERC was trying to figure out what the risk to low impact is, and you know what's missing out of the requirements, they didn't know, and they had no idea. In medium and high, we have, you know, you have to provide the list, you have an inventory, all these things, so they have a good feeling around those from all their audits and everything else. But for low impact, you know, it's a location. You know,
Right.
what does that mean? You know, is that one thing? Is it 50? Is it 1,000? We don't know. So yeah, that was really just a way for us to try to get down to the components that really mattered in a way that wasn't overly burdensome to the entity to answer the questions. And you can see the actual survey is attached in that same report that everybody had to answer if you haven't seen it before. So.
Now, from the industry side, was there, and you can go into the next one because I think this leads into it. You know, a lot of the percentages that came out that said, hey, there weren't a lot of low impact only sites, like they were encompassed in other high and medium like programs.
Yeah.
But I can imagine the community saw this as, and maybe will see this as a way to start to put inventory requirements down onto low impact or monitoring requirements, because those words are there. And so is this a way for NERC to worm in with hard data and say, oh, we're going to use external vendor access to now kind of broaden the scope?
Yeah, and this data right here was very enlightening to me because you know, the figure 2.6, it talks about entities that have something other than just low. So is this indicative of the fact that those actually understand and recognize the standards and the requirements for, you know, it's going to be a substation, it's going to be medium. They understand those requirements, and therefore they don't also allow remote access to the lows that they have under their belt? Or is it, you know, is that showing that the folks that just have low impact require more assistance because they are
Right.
not as large, perhaps? And that's also part of the equation that we didn't drill into. But it's certainly, the data speaks to the fact that for the smaller entities, the ones that just have low impact facilities, you've got a lot more that are allowing remote access by a huge margin. You know, pretty massive delta there. Now, also the numbers are very, very, you know, statistics lie, right? So you got to be careful about the numbers of substations involved and entities answering these questions. But overall, I found this very, very enlightening and interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just from what I've seen, and I'm sure you know, Jason, I've been consulting with you for years. I've
Right.
seen the same thing. The low impact only programs are very different than
Yes.
the programs that are for high, medium, and low.
Right. They're much more refined, stripped down,
Yeah.
applying far less protections. Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and speaking of statistics that lie, I think in the report it mentioned that while they're not giving, you know, there's no y-axis here. Like you can, you know, so it's kind of vague. Is that, you know, what number is that? Is that 10? Is that 1,000? They mentioned something about out of the 1,000 entities, this is representative of like 27% of the. So you know, if you do some reverse math, you're like, okay, but yeah, Jason, to your point, I imagine that the sites that have high, medium, and low, they're just saying, oh, well, the low impact facilities just inherit the controls that we have for all of the high and medium. But
Yeah,
low
you know,
impact only sites don't benefit from that, right?
Right,
Nothing to
exactly. Those entities that have the experience, they roll down many of the same protections, maybe not the same level as the low impact, but they have the expertise to identify what needs to be protected and then at least apply a subset of those protections to those low impact facilities versus low impact only. They were kind of starting from square one and having to build something up and couldn't take advantage of that experience.
Yeah, just the level of quality in the documentation is always one thing we notice right away for the audits. But in addition to that, there's so many of the controls that are kind of, I guess, not necessarily redundant, but apply downward, like your you don't technically have to have an ESP, but those that have high and medium usually have a very ESP-like system in their lows because that's what they're operationally used to maintaining, right? You just get economy of scale in your knowledge base and the equipment that you purchased and your existing documentation programs and all those things. So yeah, I mean, it just rolls down in a much more effective way. Even things like, you know, your CIP-8 program and your CIP-6 physical controls. Yeah, there's just a completely different world when it's just low, because it is just so different. Okay, so this was an interesting quote we pulled out. And Carter, I want you to lean on this one as well. But while these locations represent a small percentage of all transmission substations and substation locations, the combined effect of a coordinated cyber attack on multiple locations could impact BES reliability beyond the local area, right? So this is kind of a key message that we're seeing in this coordinated cyber attack theme. We see this now, it's probably going to be used to drive other changes to low impact.
That's right. And this is a whole different, I mean, I have done entire presentations on where this language comes from because it's interesting history, but we won't get into that here. Just be aware that these words, a coordinated cyber attack, are through and through going to be used to push a number of different initiatives and make improvements over what is seen as a lackluster control set for low impact. You can also see that in the supply chain risk report that just came out from NERC and was approved by the board. There's a small group of us that were involved in helping draft that as well, where we actually looked at all the deltas between where the low impact standards are and what the possible world is of missing parts and pieces. But this coordinated cyber attack is central to all of those things and really key to it. So just keep that in mind, folks. When you're asking yourself, why is this happening? There's your driver.
Is that the trigger phrase? Like, are we going to be hammered with that constantly, almost like on the physical security side as well? Well, if we get 20 idiots with guns, you know, yeah. There was actually a question, maybe semi-related to this from the channel, Carter, that maybe you can address. Is the idea that I think with low impact sites, they're more likely to have managed facilities, so therefore vendor external remote access. When they did the original data call, I want to say in the report it said it was registered entities, but was there any kind of nuance as to which one of those registered entities were really using a third party to manage or operate the facility and they just happened to own it? Or was it just kind of all mixed bag?
Yeah, there was no specifics on that. I don't think we had enough forethought to ask those types of questions during the survey. And even if we did, I think we would have gotten a lot of pushback on that too.
Yeah.
So
Right.
Yeah, and in some cases, the vendors have to register as a GOP, you know, for example, if they're operating the facility, depending. Now, you can do that via contract, or there's other crafty ways to do that with interesting types of registration functions. But yeah, in most cases, a lot of them that are doing that are already registered as GOPs. And there's even some GOP balancing authorities. So it's interesting. That's a great question.
And I think from the person asking, that may be the logical leap, right? Is that, you know, a high percentage of low impact facilities are de facto, you know, outsourced or remotely managed. I know we were talking before the panel about renewables and the unique operating environments that they work in. That is just really not, you know, there's no match for high medium BES asset, you know, frameworks out there. So that just may be a natural consequence of how low impact sites are run.
Yeah,
right. A lot of times they're geographically out in the middle of nowhere, so you don't not necessarily full of staff. So you need to leverage vendors and people to help perform their maintenance and things of that nature as well. So that's something else to keep in mind.
And it's certainly outside of the scope of our conversation right now, but DERs are definitely the next stage of focus for a lot of cybersecurity requirements and everything else. But
yeah, DER and IDEO, the inverter-based resources. And there's a whole, you know, now there's a giant, what used to be just a thread, it's actually a movement, it's a working stream within NERC on managing inverter-based resources. So I think more to come on that. Stay tuned. I mean, that's going to be a very significant shift because we know, everyone that remembers, I'm sure, in Texas is very aware of just how big of an impact inverter-based resources can have on your system. Yeah, and other areas.
And in fact, NERC just issued the NERC alert for IBR as well too. That's due in June.
Yeah, I saw that. Okay. So this is the actual language out of the docket. We determined that the proposed reliability standard improves upon the effective standard of CIP-003-8 by adding new requirements focused on supply chain risk management for the low impact stuff. This actually has nothing to do with supply chain, even though it says supply chain. When most people in the CIP world hear supply chain, they instantly think of CIP-13, right? That's where your brain goes right away. So, I remember when we were communicating, this got passed and we're in various different circles. Carter and Ron, you're in some of the same ones I am. They were like, wait a minute, these aren't supply chain standards. Like, no, it's not CIP-13, but it deals with vendors. So no, it has nothing to do with CIP-13, and it actually looks like a carbon copy of CIP-5, just brought down into low impact. Right. Yeah. And Jason, didn't you have a conversation with one of the regions about this?
I did actually, because originally we thought there was going to be an expectation to incorporate this into your either a CIP-13 or CIP-13-like program for actually performing risk assessments involving procurement and your cybersecurity staff to formally vet the vendor. But as you said, in fact, this is really just more of a carbon copy of the controls in place for CIP-5R3 for vendor remote access.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, and they do, as the bullet says, it's important to have a consistent approach towards your vendors throughout the standard. So if you're doing something radically different for your low impact that you're doing for medium and high, it's certainly allowed. But by all means, auditors look for inconsistency, and any inconsistency is going to be a snag, and they're going to want to talk about it. So if you want like Teflon auditor repellent programs, make them as consistent as possible.
Yep.
Yep.
I think to your point, Patrick, and I think you posted just today that the new internal NSM stuff is up for a 30-day comment.
Yep.
It does feel like a Trojan horse for just network security monitoring, right?
Yeah.
And they're using the vendor and the supply chain risk as that catalyst. But to your point, even in programs that already have established 005 kind of controls, you wouldn't want to do something wildly different just because it has the word vendor remote on it. You would incorporate that into your existing ESP and your monitoring and EACS, all that stuff. So this does feel, again, I can only imagine from a low impact only facility, this feels like, wait, we have to stand up an entire detection and monitoring program just for third-party vendors now? And how is that going to spider out to the rest of my environment?
Yeah, and though INSM is a different discussion, it's certainly very closely tied to this because it's going to feel a lot like the way this felt. And those of us that participated in this original section 1600 data request, as we saw that stack earlier, we had the 1600 data request, the report, then the SAR was issued to draft the standard, and then the standard was adopted by FERC. That same thing is about to happen under INSM because as part of the INSM order, was to go do a similar study to this exact same thing. So it's going to look and feel very similar. There's a high likelihood that that study is going to come back with there's already been a section 1600 data request issued for INSM. And
right.
Then they're going to get the data back. They're going to do a report. The report's likely going to lead to a SAR and then to some more changes into the low impact space. So, that if I'm reading the tea leaves, I have no reason to expect any different path for that.
Right. Yeah, just reading like in some of the supplemental material, it says, for section 6.3, document showing implementation of processes, technologies, whatever. And then it lists bullets that are like multi-year programs, anti-malware, intrusion detection, automated or manual log reviews. And you're like, these are not like small potatoes.
No, and for low impact only programs, this is a very significant amount of change. I mean, it's not just something, no big deal, we'll just monitor the vendors and put them on.
Check that box.
Right, yeah, because those will effectively become the expectation of the auditors because that's what was written.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, and Ron, I love the fact that I know you built this part of this one slide, but the little sign generator, I love these. These are great.
I'm gonna get those printed out for my house now. Those are in a Beer ISAC Slack channel, and man, that's my new thing this week.
Oh.
I love those.
Gosh,
All of us.
Carter had some spicy ones as well.
yes, there were some really, really good ones there. Yeah, maybe on the show notes, we'll include the link to the sign generator for all to use, because these are hilarious. And you should be using these in your compliance program, because they'll definitely get attention and raise awareness. Okay, so on the left, we've got, if SIP low impact sites do not have an ESP, what does remote mean for SIP 3-9? Yeah, expect some wild interpretations. And we use interpretations with a lowercase I because there is a formal interpretation process. So we're going to get probably a bunch of different audit approaches on this at the beginning. The regions will likely have some differences of opinion. You will have differences of opinion with your auditors. And then after some degree, we will iron out the wrinkles over time and figure out what normal looks like. But that's how it's always been in the past. I don't see it changing. But let's speculate a little bit on what are some of these interpretations we're going to see.
Yeah, I definitely point to section 3.1 in SIP 3 for the basic definition of where you need to be for what does remote mean. Well, you should have definitions of where your firewalls are. Yeah. So anything traversing that boundary should be considered remote. And then we can slap on other words on top of that to help further define it. But that's the basics for those of you just looking for the easy cut and dry answer.
Yeah. And I've seen like low impact ESP that doesn't exist. You can't really have a low impact ESP because the definition of ESP applies.
Lurk and leap. You don't remember all that? Come on now.
Why did we get rid of that? I know. Yeah. So effectively, you can use air quote low impact ESP, but because anything outside of whatever that boundary line is effectively going to be remote, and that's going to be the interpretation. That'll be the approach. And for those that use,
I was just going to say, I'm not trying to be like too, splitting of the hairs, but I think, Jason, your point, and to the previous question, a lot of these are remotely managed or operated or through like a, managed service. So, a lot of these architecturally, they're coming in through the enterprise network. They're not just VPNing or remoting directly in, they're provisioning them through like an organization. And then, that role or that group happens to have access to the right jump host or the right network. And so remote in this instance is going to be really, like, I could see from a pre-audit stance, it's like, well, none of this is really remote because it's coming from the enterprise. It's like, well, no, you're letting the vendor come in through your enterprise, so how many hops does remote versus not remote mean? Especially, I've even been onboarded as an employee, like contractor employee into a lot of these systems where you get the real domain.com account. Are those now remote connections or are those part of the organization? So I think as we have a number of years before this is actually implemented, getting that language down is going to be key. Similar from the old days with visitor logs and everything else. It's like sometimes auditors get caught up on the weirdest stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you mentioned visitor logs. As a former auditor, that was, if the entity was particularly problematic, we would just stop and camp on the visitor logs and find a violation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Tick marks are a real thing. Yeah. Well, and that's, and I think that goes to the point of preparation. I think it's 2026. This actually starts to become.
We have a slide on the implementation plan coming up. Yeah.
Right. Part of the cycle. And so, getting that down and defining your language very clearly, that way you have a defensible position as you're going in, as opposed to trying to explain to an auditor what you feel remote is.
Yeah, and work with your peers. Each region has a group. MRO's got one, and WEC has WCIF, and NPCC has TFIST, and there's all the different groups. Use them to your advantage. Work together. There's safety in numbers. You want to be in the center of the herd of wildebeest and not on the periphery, getting picked off by the other predators. Okay, and then the reference models. A lot of people use those reference models, and they would like cut and paste the pictures into their diagrams or their company documents. I've seen them so many times during audits. But yeah, they're not there anymore. So they're probably going to live on as a legacy, like many of our other legacy documents continue to live on. But yeah, they're gone. Yeah, I think this is a standard approach now. We're seeing a lot of this. The GTBs and other additional language are being stripped out of the standards. for better or for worse. I mean, and we can have probably an entire conversation.
Yeah, don't get me started on that.
The benefit on that, benefit and loss on that, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
Carter, get started on that. I mean, I early on I found them, especially when you're building the program, they were helpful because it was guardrails, but then I found organizations were starting to argue over the reference models as opposed to the actual, intent of the controls. So I think the reason why I put these two together is if I was building a new program now for low impact only facilities, not having that reference material that the industry has argued and come to agreement on over a decade, not having that now seems like a big gap.
I agree. Yeah. So if you're a new low impact program, go back and look at the history.
If you can find it.
Yeah, if you can find it. Yeah.
And look at the history, and like you said, Patrick, work with your user groups, reach out to your regions too, because many of them have technical advisors now that can help you get a direction established as well.
Yeah. And this one I wanted to put this one in real quick because it's this one had 4 drafts, and not all the standards go through this many. I mean, we'll talk about CIP-10 some other time and how many times that one's had to go around the tree. But yeah, multiple bites. We had 4 drafts on this one. 6.3 in particular got the most, I guess, deliberation, and you can see the difference in the language there. Carter, I think you were involved in this directly, if I'm not mistaken.
I had some close friends that were much closer to it than I was, but I had a lot of conversations with a lot of folks around this as to why there was such controversy. The SAR itself just calls out just vendor remote access, the malicious communications. It doesn't mention the vendor remote access, so they actually had to go back and talk to the folks that authored the SAR to say, what did you mean? Did you mean just when a vendor is connected? Is that when we have to look for malicious communications, or is it all the time on all the in and outs and gazintas and gazatas they're going through our network? And you can, that was a lot of back and forth. And you can now see, obviously, that in 6.3, there is the caveat for vendor remote access. So, does that mean that you only have to watch when they're connected? Does it only mean you have to watch just the communications that are associated with that vendor remote access? What happens if somebody were to, leave something behind and it communicated later? Is that okay? There's a lot of questions we have around this still.
Yeah. And the earlier language, I know there was some discussion around it, opened the door for all traffic, just everything. And some deliberation on that. Yeah. Okay. And the drafting team was aware of the difference between remote access versus remote monitoring. And this one is, access, well, you can, not a perfect definition, but a good analogy is SCADA. There's supervisory control, and then there's just data acquisition. So if you're just and they're just viewing something, it's, is that actually remote access? And then, of course, we have some of the probable challenges with auditors around remote access versus remote control. Those are going to look like different discussions. Just to be safe, if it's communications to the vendor, you probably want something there in terms of control. It's just because NERC wants all of it monitored and controlled. We know that. That's been kind of overtly communicated by them.
I can add some anecdotes from previous life. We have a lot of things with manufacturers that have agreements in place that you have to keep monitoring of the equipment in order to stay, within the bounds of your warranty,
your contract.
So that is constant monitoring that goes on. Keep an eye on those things, because sometimes the vendors that will install access control device, aka a firewall in front of those devices and say, look, we protected it, actually have the administrative function connected to the same thing that's, you're supposed to be protecting from. So make sure you look at those things, make sure you're understanding how they are, what function they're actually providing. Are they truly doing what they say they're doing, or are they just, an any rule on a blanky box that's really just a more of a liability than an asset? So check those out and make sure you're aware of how that works.
Yeah, and I can't imagine that pointing to the service agreement and saying, well, the vendor said they're only going to monitor and not make any changes is going to be enough for an auditor otherwise. So it's going to be very difficult to, and I know in the early days we tried to do this, with the GEs of the world and the like, to say, well, no, they've assured us they're only doing this, and here's an attestation. And then when you start looking at the traffic, you're like, well, no, they can do pretty much whatever they want. I think especially for those facilities that haven't, they're new to NERC, that's not going to work. You're going to have to provide some sort of evidence to show that it's bi-directional, we're monitoring it, here's the documented process. I know in section 6 there's a lot of documentation, or at least call outs for documentation, so don't forget that. Even if you suspect or don't think you have any remote connections, you still document the how you verified that,
Right.
how you're checking on it.
Yeah, you're gonna have to prove the
things of
negative.
that nature.
Yeah, and in many cases, more than just an attestation of now we're good. You're gonna need something that can show it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's imperative, because at the end of the day, we're the ones responsible for compliance, not your vendors. So I'm just saying, perform those checks, but also perform them on a frequent basis, not just a one-time check and assume we're good to go moving forward.
Yeah, because you got between now and we'll talk about the implementation plan, but it's a long time before this is actually required to be enforced.
Right.
Okay, so I had a little fun. I asked ChatGPT in the context of, you can see my question at the top, in the context of NERC CIP, what is the definition of vendor? And I got to say, ChatGPT did a pretty good job of this. So I think in lieu of any other definition, if you don't already have one, you can borrow this one. It's actually not that bad. As a like I say, a recovering regulator, this would have passed for me. So for whatever that's worth. So there's a lot of consternation around the fact that these are not defined terms. They're not in the NERC glossary of terms. We've had lots of rants and frankly, what would almost qualify as bar fights over the fact that this is not defined and it makes so much room for interpretation. And Ron, to your point, am I a vendor if I'm onboarded as an employee style contractor? I've got a domain address. I've gone through all the same background checks and screening. Effectively, I am no different than any other employee or contractor in the company. So where is that line around vendor? And this is an interesting problem we're going to have to continue to debate. I also asked ChatGPT in the context of NERC CIP, what is the definition of vendor electronic remote access? It was less good on this one, but it did a pretty good job. And it talks about, different types of access through things like VPNs, RDP, web-based applications. It's not good enough in my opinion, but it's fair. But one of the things I thought was curious in this, it was a reminder of the fact that yes, things like web-based applications do count. So things like right now, you're on Zoom. There's an option for remote control in Zoom. And there are some utilities that think there is such thing as logical escorted access, which honestly doesn't exist. They can view, but they can't control. That's very clearly stated by NERC in multiple ways. But yeah, this was an interesting exercise to see what we could get in terms of some external opinions on definitions for these, since NERC didn't define them. So effectively, what this means is you're gonna have to define these on your own. Yeah, and I think, as we mentioned, check with your regions, check with your peers, check with your local groups, your regional working groups that are entity-based, for example, and kind of come to a common collective on this. And in some cases, your trade organizations, we have one on with us, can also help with this. If you're in the transmission side, although I don't see much of this affecting transmission, but NATF and NAGF definitely, but work together to figure out what this looks like. So you're not just handed a definition or an interpretation or approach by a wayward auditor.
Yep. I'd say this also harkens back to the early days of CIP-2 with defining what programmable electronic device means to you.
Oh God.
So,
right. Just had an aneurysm, Carter. Thank you. Man. Okay, so implementation plan coming up. You've got basically 3 years. You got a while. Now, this is both good and bad, and we'll talk about why and some of the recommendations, because a lot of things can change in 3 years. And I know we'd like to say we're utilities, we move slowly, there's not a lot changing. I beg to differ. Yes, that's probably true in like your big transmission installations. Your generation space, especially like you're now in your distribution space, even though it doesn't apply here, but it's going to get closer and closer and closer to applying because of DER and IBRs are now on the docket. You're going to look at what distribution means and how that's going to affect transmission and other components here in the not too distant future. So a lot will change in 3 years for us. I mean, the pace at which we're implementing new technologies and new generation and the mix within our system will drive this to change within 3 years in ways we just don't foresee. So be mindful of what's going to happen between now and then. That doesn't mean just sit on your hands until, January of 2026 and then try to ramp up something. That will be far, far too late. And as I mentioned, you can see in the implementation plan, it always lets you know if there are any definitions that are changing with the standard. None, nothing changed. No new definitions, as we mentioned, which of course is frustrating to all of us. And then you can see on the initial performance. So what happens on day one? That's what that means. Like, what is the initial performance requirement? And then of course, it's basically you've got your bookend statements. And then of course, you need to be compliant to all of R1 before the effective date. That's the expectation. And then of course, any of the periodic requirements that are there existing, you can just maintain your periods. And
one other thought here, if you're looking at a long lead implementation time, think about INSM if you are low impact. Patrick and I did a nice webinar or podcast together on that. You can go pick that up from Ampere site, but there's some thoughts there that could align. So if you're going to think about doing this type of a thing and you have nothing, just consider what you might also be able to do at the same time to help you, so you don't have to go through things more than once.
Yeah, and the low impact, the INSM requirements for high and medium with ERC, they're required to be turned around to FERC within a year, basically, but 15 months, a NERC year, we'll say. So that's going to start on the high and medium with ERC side, but of course they were directed to produce within an actual 12-month window, a year, the report on low impact. So I can say these two things they're not necessarily joined at the hip, but man, they're super close. There is a bunch of overlap in the Venn diagram between these two things with INSM and this one. Okay, so what do you do about all this, right? And this is kind of the meat, and we've got a good 20 minutes to discuss a lot of these recommendations. So first things first, determine if you even want remote access, right? I do know some that don't have a lot of low impact assets, and if they're not widely geographically distributed, then they don't mind rolling a truck, right? That's okay. But as Jason mentioned earlier, there's a lot of these, probably the bulk of them, they're not close and they're geographically distributed and they're all over the place and they're out in the middle of nowhere, and windshield time is going to be problematic. So in those cases, if you decide to not put some sort of remote access in a very distant geographic location, you're asking for trouble. Because honestly, engineers and technicians get creative and they're going to stop off at Best Buy and they're going to find a way to make this easier for them and not have to get in the truck for 4 hours to go to some remote location and they forgot their thermos. It's just not something that you want to run into from an operational side. So consider whether or not you want to hold that hard line if that's your current position. That said, it could also be a really great motivator for modernization projects. And I know Ron and I, we've had some conversations on kind of use this, right? Use this as, something to actually get the things that you need in those areas. Of course, make sure you're ensuring that Section 6 requirements are considered. And then it's going to be much easier to do assessments on your current architecture, but your future stuff, like I said, a lot of stuff can change within 3 years. Make sure that those future changes, you're still looking to this standard to make sure that it's it has to go through this mesh in order to make it into that future design. Yeah,
I'd jump on and add a couple of thoughts on there because like we were just talking about with the INSM stuff, you have the alignment. One of those architectural alignments is looking at your network architecture and figuring out, can you create choke points for remote access? Can you bring it all back into a single place that you can do all your monitoring from and then get somebody onto a jump host or, use zero trust or some of these other technologies that are out there to help really control the access, but also monitor it, maybe record the sessions, maybe, provide yourself some more evidence that you're doing all the right things and you're able to prove that compliance component for the vendor remote access and be able to cut it off in one place. So you don't have to worry about, that vendor's got access to 15 different facilities. Now I got to go and cut it off at 15 different places because, X happened. Think about that. Think about how you're going to actually, implement some of this stuff and make it easier on yourself if you can.
Yeah, because what you write down as your program, this is one of those standards where they kind of choose your own adventure. You can make, they give you the rope, you can make a trap, or you can make a hammock. So make yourself a hammock, make something that's easy that you can follow, because in the event that you write something that is technically compliant, like we're just going to manually do this at 15 substations or 15 generation facilities, and then something happens and you actually have to do that, now you're on the hook for demonstrating that you did. So be mindful of that. Okay, the next one, what solution are you using right now for your higher meeting for CIP-003? Because that's already there, right? And is that going to work for this? Can you just borrow that solution and move it over to low? Just add low to what you're already doing for high and medium, for those that obviously have high and medium, right? And if it's not going to work, well, then you got to do things like change your architecture, buy some technology, change your processes. And the 3 years might seem like a lot of time between now and then, but I'm hearing of supply chain concerns right now where some vendors are talking about 18 months for delivery of hardware for certain pieces of hardware. So, and we don't know what the future looks like. We do have an ongoing war in another part of the country, another part of the planet, that will likely have some impact on some of the vendors that we deal with, if not direct impact on us between now and then, because of just the obvious implications of cyber war.
Yeah, it's a great point to get in front of that now, Patrick. I know some entities that ordered their hardware for CIP-12 about 18 months ago, and they're still waiting for that to come. So yeah, identify that early and get on top of it now.
Great example.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Okay, real quick, we got a question that came in. What are the comments on zero trust for supply chain transactions, including only monitoring? Carter, you mentioned zero trust. You want to go there?
Yeah. So I mean, zero trust is, it's
by zero trust.
it's a very convoluted conversation because it means different things to different people. But if you think about it in the aspects of remote access and having a device that is controlled by you that folks come into, and then you can then record sessions like I was talking about. It's a number of vendors that do these types of things. But then it controls the access to just the asset they need to talk to from that point. You don't have lateral movement in the network. You don't have this carte blanche VPN access. Those types of things are a lot easier to not only monitor, but then there's a lot fewer things you have to do for all your other processes down the line. If you have everything focused in one place and you're concentrated, all your SIEM, all your logging, all your, all the access controls, it's a lot easier to do that in one place. Plus, a lot of these zero trust implementations allow you dashboards to see what is going on currently, and you can just push the button to kill it instantly. A lot of times folks rely on removing account controls to disable, remote access. Well, that might take time for a refresh. Or it might take time for that, that account disablement to actually affect the user's ability to move in the environment or be functional in the environment. Yeah. So those are some of the pros that we can certainly get out of zero trust, and hopefully that that answers the question.
Yeah, another phrase that's used from a technology side is secure remote access, right? You see SRA a lot in, technology or kind of monitoring or security adjacent technologies, and I think, Carter, to your point, the confidence level in showing a dashboard and saying, yes, this is how we deprovision, this is how we monitor, this is how we this. From an audit stance, that type of evidence is more confidence in the repeatability of the actual control, as opposed to, well, here's a Active Directory log. We had a ticket come in through some help desk thing, and then someone approved it. Then here's a log where we removed them from AD. It's like, so it not that you need to push technology, but to Carter's point, you got to make this as easy as possible for you. And if you have a 3-year runway to do that, set yourself up for success as opposed to more manual labor.
Yes. Okay, and then the last one there, architectural assessments are crucial. We kind of talked a little bit about this, but you really need to know what's going in and out of your network in your low impact space. And you should, if you're low impact already, you're kind of required to already have some sort of a boundary. Now it's incumbent upon you to know what's going through that boundary. There isn't the same level of requirement like in CIP-5 where you've got to approve every open port. Not in low, but this kind of gets toward that where you should know, because now you got to know one specific thing at least that's coming through that network at least. So this is kind of where it starts, and then likely going to be INSM as well, as we mentioned.
And this is something you can do now. There's no supply chain dependency on this. You know, and to be honest, well, one of my biggest fears with the lead time with new NERC controls like this, you know, being 3 years, is that and this is something I would do. I'd be like, well, let's go do an assessment. Nope, there's no remote vendor access here, and then you just kind of shelf it and you forget about it. You don't kind of keep an eye every year on, well, what new programs are being put in, what new technologies. So, you know, architecture assessments are an ongoing thing, and especially for those low impact sites that aren't used to the level of granularity, like, well, we have these ports open to the external ingress egress. This is a good excuse to start training, you know, exercising those processes.
And don't forget about the other component of this addition to the standard, that monitoring for malicious communications. If you use you know, RDP, that's encrypted. How are you actually looking at that stuff, you know, in the stream to make sure that you don't? I'm not suggesting you have to, but that's certainly something you need to think about. And you need to document in your process and your controls to say, this is how we're controlling it. And you know, there's different ways to skin that cat. But make sure you're thinking about that when you're putting these different architectures in place and the controls that you've got going. So.
Well, if it's a vendor, Carter, how could it be malicious? Come on.
That's true. That is true. They couldn't possibly do anything bad.
We've never had like a SolarWinds type event that's happened that the government is super sensitive to right now. That
just in the movies,
down into regulation.
Only in the movies.
Yeah. It's just, well, in the movies you just type faster and you can break encryption. Yeah, but that's an excellent point, Carter, because that's why the jump host requirements are in place for interactive remote access in CIP-5, and they drop encryption at the boundaries so it can be inspected. Yeah. Okay, next, identify all the individuals who play a role in the relevant operations, right? You want to go talk to the people in the low impact spaces and get their opinions. Don't just think that IT or OT have it all down, because they're the people that work with these environments, your actual, you know, like line staff in a generation plant, they know what vendors they work with, and they're likely going to say, oh yeah, we also have that, you know, that, believe it or not, modem that talks back to like Foxborough or someone. It's been there for the past 15 years and no one, you know, managed to spot it over the time because things like CVAs aren't required in low impact. So you're going to have that situation where there are things that you just don't know about. And you want to talk to the operations people to go find that out. Basically show up with a box of donuts or kolaches and sit down with them and have that conversation of, what do you know? Where do the vendors come in and what can they see?
Yeah, kind of a real world example for that is I was involved in a CIP-12 implementation, and the OT team thought they had it all figured out. Where's the RTA, RTM data? And we decided to open it up to other business units that are either using that data or working with vendors. And we actually discovered multiple different data sources. So to your point, if you have these broader conversations, you might identify other vendors with other potential points of access, you know, either at the network layer or the application layer or things of that nature. So definitely do your homework and cast a wide net and be much more sure to be compliant.
Yeah, you got plenty of time. So
Yep.
And sometimes these things come, like what Patrick was talking about, they come from places you don't expect. Bentley, Nevada, vibration monitoring. Some of those have remote access so that they can, you know, send the data back and keep an eye on things. Make sure you understand how that functions and works so that you don't have another situation where you've got a system that could actually trip off a facility that you're not even thinking about. And now all of a sudden now you have remote access, but you also have, you know, a compliance problem.
Right. And if you're doing physical lockdowns, which are definitely recommended, be mindful of things that don't look like modems or traditional comm equipment, because protocol converters can come in all kinds of shapes and sizes.
That's right.
Yeah. So take the
I think one other thing to mention and think about with vendors, you know, a lot of these, they want to help you. You know, a lot of the vendors want to be on your side. So talk to them. And some of them are actually thinking about this already. So go to them early and talk about those things. Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And that's really where we need to be with those conversations is working with them, not against them, not, you know, you don't want to be fighting them all the time on these things. And some of them are actually wanting to push towards centralized remote access, you know, having all the comms come to one place because it helps them help you.
Exactly. It's hard for them.
But yeah, it takes a lift and it takes understanding and time. So make sure you start those conversations early. Yeah.
And we've also got in there, if you don't necessarily trust a vendor, then put your own equipment in place or put yours on, you know, on the just adjacent to theirs so that you can control their access on the inside, for example, which is not uncommon. I even see, a lot of times like the OT folks will put their own firewall just inside the IT firewall because they want to manage their own access. So, you can kind of treat that the same way with the vendors. You definitely want to work with your vendors, but you also have to manage your vendors. As we mentioned, some of them can be more trustworthy than others. Certain vendors have elements within the vendor that are different than other business units and that kind of thing. So just, work with them, but also manage them.
Well, we had another question mentioning again the dreaded Atlanta Data Highway. So,
Yeah.
and I think Carter might be able to speak to this more specifically, but over the years it's become less of a meme and a story that consultants talk about at the bar. And I mean, there is a lot of consolidation, security controls, like architecture built around that connection, because GE has recognized that it is a remote connection into facilities. So you do actually, I would say nowadays with Atlanta Data Highway, you inherit a lot of controls and a lot of monitoring, a lot of the things that would help with, this new revision, just by having that connection. So it's, it's better than setting up TeamViewer for someone.
Yep.
You're inheriting a lot of controls,
Yeah.
by letting GE into your turbine. So
it runs the gamut of security nightmares, and speaking of them specifically, I've seen everything from very horrible practices all the way up to very good ones. And a lot of that depends on how new your implementation is. If you're doing regular refreshes with them, you're going to be in a much better place than you haven't touched the stuff in 20 years. But they are much more cognizant of this, and the designs that they're coming up with are actually ones that I've tried to push for decades. And I'm glad to see that they're getting there. I'm glad to see that they're actually understanding that it's good to segregate things out, and the Purdue model actually means something other than just a pretty diagram. So
It's not dead yet. What? Anyway, yeah. Also,
we killed that 2 years ago.
I know, and no one's mentioned Emerson yet, but anyway, yeah. All right. Got that one. And let's see. Yeah. And of course, another option is you can take control over the equipment they have installed, and you can, of course, check their work. If you have admin access to their device, then you can see what's inside there, and it's not just some, mythical black box for you that you can't see.
Yep. And hint, maybe you should have admin rights to it.
Yeah, you should. And then, okay. Last slide. To begin gathering evidence and prepare documentation, just start now. It's going to take you a while to get there. No sense in delaying. As we talked about, there are a bunch of reasons why you should probably get on this now and start inserting it into your projects, because between now and 3 years from now, there's a lot that's going to change. And if you just wait until then, a lot of the ground's going to move underneath your feet, and you're going to have even more work to do then, and you'll be doing it, as we say, you'll be turning the battleship in the bathtub versus, much earlier time and arcing it into port when you need it. But a great recommendation is to start with if you don't have a program, this is actually a really good recommendation. Like if you're new to this and you just got low impact, you can look at the violation language and work backward. Like what are they going to target me in terms of my violation state? So what could they find me in violation for? So these two bullets here are the actual language out of the violation statements in the VRFs, VSLs. Basically failed to document the security processes for remote access security controls, and then failed to document and implement them. So those are the two. Now there's a lot involved in there, and this gives the auditors a really wide amount of latitude in order to interpret what this means. So get ahead of this early, decide what you're going to do. And in a lot of cases, if you decide now and you build the process now and make everyone follow it now, you're already going to be compliant by the time 36 months rolls around, right? Even though you're not required to do it now, you manage that change over time, because like I say, there's just going to be a lot of change between now and 3 years from now. Don't get tripped up on the documentation side. For those, especially if you don't have a lot of remote access right now, there is a chance you will, especially with like distributed generation. I mean, that's going to be, you don't have people on site. It's just that simple. You don't have people on site. You will likely need some form of remote access. And then, as we've harped many times, don't wait to begin. And I can't stress it enough. This is not something you want to just sit and wait and do it at the last minute.
Yeah, last thought on documentation. Like you said, Patrick, proving the negative, just take the controls, build out the documentation, even if you think or that you don't have any remote access. Break it all out, anti-malware, IDS, break out all the requirements and just put in there, not applicable at this time, et cetera, et cetera. And that way you have that skeleton, that framework. So then if projects come in, now you can just feed in and see. And then if you get to 2026 and you still have no vendor remote access, at least you have something to show to the auditors to say, no, we've been tracking this for a number of years. And this is how we validated that remote access doesn't exist. That's a confidence booster. They may not dig a little deeper if you have that in line.
Yeah, and they're going to want to know with low impact. One of the bigger challenges, you're not required to have an inventory, right? But having been on that side of the fence, one of our biggest questions is, prove to me that you wrap your arms around the whole known universe of low things. How do we know you got it all? That you've got 3 years to try to figure out how you're going to demonstrate that. Start now. Yeah. Any final thoughts, Carter, Jason?
No, I think we've covered almost everything. I really appreciate the time and this conversation. I think it was really good.
Fantastic.
Me as well. It's very insightful. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks everyone for attending. Hope to see you soon on the next webinar. Again, we'll have it recorded, posted, share it if you like. Thanks.
Bye,
Be
everybody.
safe all.